Is the King James the only right English Bible? Why is this still one of the most highly read versions today? And how should it be used, if at all, today in personal study and within the church? My guest today, Timothy Berg, is a theology student, and he's spent tons of his time and life studying the King James Bible. In fact, he has a site, kjbhistory.com. Tim, thanks for joining me to talk about this.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad to be here.
Well, let's jump right in. I'm really curious why you think the King James Version of the Bible is one of the most highly read versions. And one study said it was number one, but a recent one I pulled up said in April 2022 said it's maybe moved down to number four. But regardless, it's one of the top read English Bibles in the world. Why do you think this is the case?
Yeah, that's a really good question. One of the things that we need to remember when we look at numbers like that, whether it's listed as number one, the highest, or number two, or three, or four, wherever it's ranked, is a drop from the position that it once held. Because from sometime in the 1660s to the mid 1880s, it was the universally used English
Mm.
Bible. So when people talked about using quote unquote the Bible without any other qualification, they were referring to the King James Bible. So wherever it gets ranked today is in some sense a drop in its use because there are so many competitors now. But it does continue to be used, and I think will always profitably be continue to be used, because in one sense it's the most majestic English translation. The
Mm.
language is more elegant, probably than any English translation that has ever been produced. Probably more than anyone that ever will be produced. And
Wow.
it's also, generally speaking, a very literal translation, which is what a lot of people are looking for. So I think it's going to have a long, continued history of use in the church for sure.
So it sounds like it's a combination of how beautifully it's written and the history that it's rolled, that it's just going to continue in its influence for a while. Now, you actually used the term, you said you were reared on the King James Bible. Now, I was reared in the church on the Bible, but not the
Hmm.
King James Bible. So that got my attention. What does that mean?
Yeah. So I use that language to describe the fact that I was raised in a setting that a lot of people would call quote unquote King James only. I don't personally like that term. I think it can be a little bit
Okay.
pejorative. But I was raised in really the extreme right hand wing of that movement. My mom was an author. She wrote books about the King
Wow.
James Bible, or at least a book about the King James Bible. And I believed for most of my life that the King James Bible was the only divinely authorized translation, that it was inerrant, without error, and all other translations were essentially perversions of the Word of God. So when I speak about being reared on it, I mean coming from that wing in that corner. And I attended a King James only, or at least King James Bible College, and some of
Hmm.
their grad school. So that was my life for a long time. Always reading the King James Bible for a long time, never reading anything else. That's what I mean when I speak of
Okay.
being reared on it.
So your family, your education, you're all in on this, but then you shifted your views. So maybe
Mm.
just give us a sense of what that means when you shift your views about it, and I'd be curious why you did.
Yeah, so I came to believe the position that I hold today is that the King James Bible is a great translation. I still love it and read it. My wife and
Mm.
I recently got married, and I got married using our New Cambridge Paragraph King James Bible. I really do love it and read it regularly, but I no longer hold the view today that it's the only translation that God approves, or that it's an
Okay.
inerrant translation that can't contain mistakes. Um, my views shifted there for a whole host of reasons that we wouldn't go into here. But it was a long process of coming to learn essentially that what I had been taught about the history of the King James Bible and what I had been taught about the nature of the King James Bible and the evidence behind its text was just mistaken.
Mm.
Some good men who I'm sure loved the Lord just had some really bad information
Mm.
that they had taught and that they had taught me. And as I investigated it out, I realized, looking at the primary sources myself, they were just wrong, just flat
Mm.
out wrong.
Now, I could imagine that this would come at a personal cost to you if it's your family, if it's your education, and just as much as you're comfortable, I'd love for you to just share and give an insight to that because I don't have a lot of experience with, I know you don't love this term, but King James only, people who embrace this, except speaking one time, I had someone stand up and give this monologue that was just so rude and attacking
Mm,
me about defending the King James, and it just completely caught me by surprise. And I know that doesn't characterize everybody within that group. That's not fair. but it
Right.
seems to characterize many people who hold and advance that position. So, did this come? What was that like? I guess more personally for you, as comfortable as you are sharing that.
Yeah, man, that's a really great question. Certainly, I'd want to agree with you there that that kind of quote unquote cultic mentality, and I don't love that word either, but it certainly doesn't describe everyone who holds a position where they're
Mm,
defending the King James Bible. Maybe not even describes most, but it does describe some. And it's understandable if you think about it. If you hold to the position that you have the Word of God in perfection in this particular copy or translation, and everyone else doesn't, it's only natural that there's a kind of exclusivism that would surround that view, and so that exclusivism does certainly surround many who defend the King James Bible. Fortunately, not all, but many. And it did surround the group that I was a part of. I went to a King James Bible College, Heartland Baptist Bible College, and did several years of their grad school. I served not on paid staff, but as a volunteer with the youth at the Associated Church there for, I think it was probably, I know it was well over 10 years. It might have been closer to 15 years. And when my opinion changed or my position changed on this issue, I was removed from that position. They told me
wow.
that I would never preach, teach, or be in leadership at the church ever again. In fact, they told me never to tell anyone why. And here I am telling people why I don't feel bound by that particular gag order. And I love those men and women. They're for the most part godly people who love Jesus.
Mm,
They just have a different view of the Bible than I do, and I respect them, but I don't hold that view anymore. And yes, it did definitely come at some cost.
mm. Sorry you had to go through that, and I imagine to some degree are still going through that, but I admire your courage to follow where you think truth leads and where the evidence points. That's honorable, and I'm grateful you're willing to do that. Now, I have one more question for you, and then for those
Mm-hmm.
watching, we're going to jump into an article you wrote that is super interesting. It's just on 7 misconceptions about the King James Bible, and I read this, I was like, oh, I embraced a few of these without even realizing it. So I think our
Mm.
audience is going to find this super interesting. But last question about your story. You shifted because you had what you consider a better understanding of the text and its transmission. Was the gospel itself or your personal experience of Jesus a part of this, or was it just an intellectual journey for you?
Man, that's such an important question. And I would warn us that it's always, in a sense, dangerous to describe massive or to allow massive shifts in our theology that aren't a part of a walk and a journey with Jesus. I think our
Mm,
shifts in thinking should be a part of our worship of Jesus. And it was for me. Um, for my entire life, as I described being reared in that King James group, I had built my faith, I had structured my faith intellectually in such a way that it was built upon the Bible and in particular built upon the King James Bible. I would preach from the pulpit that if there's one verse in this King James Bible that's wrong, we might as well just turn our backs on Christianity,
wow.
because that was just how I had structured my faith. The Bible was the center of my faith, and the King James Bible was the Bible. So the inerrancy of the King James was core to my being a Christian. And as I started
Wow.
asking questions about what I'd been taught about the King James, I could sense deep in my soul that I was wrestling with something where my faith itself could stand on a knife edge. Like I knew if I walk out of this the wrong way, I might walk out not a believer. And I remember some intense times of just weeping, praying with the Lord,
Wow.
scared to death about where this light might lead me, and scared to death to ask certain questions
Mm,
about the text. But in God's grace and in His mercy, through a number of good and godly men that were in my life and pouring into my life at the time, I was interning at Credo House, an apologetics ministry at the time, and we had some great apologists come and speak and teach sessions that we would record. Dan Wallace, Gary Habermas, Craig Keener, Craig Kukul, people like that would come and teach. And it didn't happen immediately, but over the course of a few years, my heart shifted and I
mm,
fell in love with Jesus and in love with the gospel in a way that I had never before. Not that I didn't
wow.
know the gospel before, I was a
Sure.
believer, but the gospel became the center of my faith. And
Mm,
whereas before I would have said, the center of my faith is the Bible, and I'll believe whatever the Bible teaches, even if it teaches a different God. If it taught 4 members of the Trinity, I'm going to follow the Bible. I came to realize that instead, now my faith was built on a resurrected person, Jesus Christ of Nazareth, who had risen from the grave. And I could ask any question that I needed to. And as
wow.
long as Jesus was alive, I could walk away and still be a believer. So my faith shifted. And when my faith shifted, I then had the courage to say, okay, I can come and I can look at the evidence, I can look at the data about the King James Bible, and I can do so with bravery because I can follow the evidence and the data wherever it goes. And at the end of it, I'll still have a risen Jesus.
Amen. And I do think that's God's grace that He enabled to bring certain people into your life. Friends of
Mm,
mine, Gary Habermas and Greg Kokel, and some of the other people that you mentioned, to get the center right. Now, this might be
yeah.
outside of your expertise, but one more question before we get to these 7 myths I have to ask you is when we put something else secondary in the center and people question the center, more often than not, what I see is not them replace the center with the historic Jesus, but either embrace a progressive Christian view or liberal theology or
Mm.
chuck the faith entirely. Do you tend to see that pattern from others who've grown up in kind of a King James only background?
Yeah, unfortunately, I would have a very long list of friends that I know personally and have been a part of their journey. And they went through exactly that same wrestling where they were wondering, has what I've been taught about the King James Bible been wrong? And they didn't make that shift in their heart where the gospel became the center of their faith. Some of them at least didn't. And as a result, ended up leaving the faith. And that's easy to do. If the King James Bible is the center of your
Yeah,
faith and you've been taught that your whole life, and that gets pulled out from underneath you like a rug, many have been left, unfortunately, without a Christian faith at all. I think that's very possible. And that's why we need to be careful in these conversations as we talk to people that have been maybe raised that way. Man, don't just attack and from their perspective, attack the Bible. Help them instead to see Jesus as the center. And you've got to do that first, or they're not in a spiritually healthy place to ask questions.
I think it's really true the way you phrased it that it's understandable why somebody told if you question King James Bible, the entire faith crumbles. They have questions about it, they leave the faith. Like that makes sense
Mm,
emotionally and it makes sense intellectually. But it's also
yeah.
why so many times when I have these conversations, I'll just ask people, I'll say, what steps did you take to make sure you weren't rejecting a caricature and are
Mm,
really rejecting what is the heart of the Christian faith? And if they look at the heart of Christian faith and reject it, at least they've rejected a steel man rather
right.
than a straw man. Now,
Right.
let's jump into these 7 misconceptions. 1 through 7, are these in any particular order, by the way?
No, no, not necessarily. And I
Okay,
would certainly add that some of them are more common than others.
okay, fair enough. This first one is one I literally never even thought about, but myth number 1 that the King James Bible isn't copyrighted.
Mm. Yeah, so that is actually one of the most common ones in my experience.
Oh,
I run across people probably on an almost weekly basis who demand that the King James Bible not only is not copyrighted, but that it is the only English Bible not copyrighted, and therefore is exclusively the words of God. The way it, not everyone would say it this way, but the way it commonly comes across is, well, you can't copyright God. You can't copyright God's words. And that's why the King James Bible is not copyrighted and all other English versions are. I taught at a church one time on the King James Bible, and it was kind of coming out of King James onlyism. And there was a line of people waiting to talk to me afterwards for, I bet I stayed for
mm,
2 hours answering questions.
wow.
Almost every one of them was there to correct me and say, no, actually, the King James Bible is not copyrighted. Because I had
Really?
said that in the course of the lectures. Just extremely common, but just
Wow.
blatantly false. If you look at the actual historical data, the King James Bible has always been held under royal patent in Britain, which was an early form of copyright. Copyright itself, in some sense, goes back to 15th century Venice. Royal patent was one form that copyright took, and the King James Bible has always been held under that patent. Cambridge University Press today holds the copyright. On their website, they list the copyright. They explain that you can't use more than 500 verses of the text or make up more than a certain percentage of whatever work you're printing, and that when
Okay.
you quote the King James Bible, you're supposed to follow with the three little letters KJV. A lot of people read that and they don't realize when people do that as a publisher, that publisher is honoring the copyright of Cambridge University Press by doing that. But yes, the King James Bible is, always has been, and as far as we know, always will be held under copyright.
That is really, really interesting and helpful. Myth number 2 the King James Bible was a new translation.
Yeah, so that I think is maybe a little less common. But when a lot of people think of the King James Bible, really when we think of any translation, we need to understand that there's two different ways a translation can be made. You can, on the one hand, do fresh pioneer translation, where you
Okay.
take a Greek and Hebrew text and a blank piece of paper, and you just translate freshly, sort of virgin soil, so to speak, directly into the target language. That's a new or fresh translation. The other way that a translation can be made is to start with a base text and revise it. So, for example, the ESV is a revision of the Revised Standard Version. They start with the base text and say, what changes should we make to this text to produce what we're after? Well, of those two ways of producing a text, the King James Bible is undeniably a revision. And the
Oh,
King James translators did not start with a blank piece of paper and a Greek text and just translate into English. They took the Bishop's Bible, specifically the 1602 edition, and we actually have copies today in the Bodleian, a collection of the sheets that they worked on, and you can watch as the
wow.
translators take that Bishop's text and they cross things out, add things in the margins. What they are doing undeniably is producing a revision of the 1602 Bishop's text, which I think is really important, especially for people who sometimes have what I would call an unhealthy view of the King James, because the King James is itself a revision. And the question that someone needs to answer if they're going to claim that that text is perfect, that it can never be revised, that it can never be changed, that nothing else is good, they need to really wrestle with the question. And I would urge them to wrestle with this question: why was God okay with all the revision that took place up until 1611, itself a revision of the bishop's text, but not okay with revision that took place after 1611?
Hmm.
They really need to wrestle with that question. And I don't think most of them have wrestled with it adequately.
That's a great question. Now, before we move to myth number three, is the new King James Version a revision? What's similar and or different about that?
Man, that is a really good question. In my own personal opinion, the New King James tends to be marketed as just one more revision of the King James. Like they'll say the King James was revised in 1612, 1638, 1762, 1769, and the New King James is just one more revision in that line. I actually think that's a very disingenuous way of painting
Hmm.
things. For one thing, because those earlier revisions of the King James were extremely minor and they were still keeping most of the form of the text the same. The New King James is rather radically different from those other forms of the King James Bible. And I don't think we should think of it, I don't think it's best thought of as one more revision of the King James. I think it's actually best thought of as a new, fresh translation from the same Greek and Hebrew text as the King James, or at least the same Greek text.
Okay,
They decided to stick with the TR, and so they translate the TR, but it's really less a revision of the King James and more, in my opinion, as I look at the text and compare them, a fresh translation from the same Greek text. So if you want the TR text and you want a fresh translation, use the New King James. It's a great Bible. I love it. But I would consider it less a revision of the King James and more a fresh translation of its text, if that
got
makes
it.
sense.
Yeah, that does. Excellent. Myth number three, the text of the King James Bible has never changed.
Yeah, that is a myth, and I just alluded to that in some sense. There are a lot of people, I think maybe even most people, who don't study the history. If they pick up a King James Bible off the shelf, they just naturally assume that what they're reading is verbally or textually identical to what was produced in 1611. Those that are more informed about the history know better. They know that the text of the King James Bible has gone through numerous revisions. Actually, I'll show you here. David Norton has done
Oh,
some of the
wow.
most careful work ever done on this particular subject in his book for Cambridge University Press, A Textual History of the King James Bible. And he just walks through the fact that the King James was edited over and over again by editors. Most of them were trying to correct errors that they saw in the text of the King James Bible. But sometimes you think you're fixing an error and you end up adding an error. And whether they were right or wrong, in all these numerous editions that have been made, there have been minor changes to the text of the King James. And when you pick a King James Bible up today, unless you're reading the facsimile, you aren't reading exactly the words that were penned in 1611. And I think we just need to recognize that as we're talking about the King James, and especially if we're going to make claims about its verbal perfection.
Now, roughly from the first time the King James was written, and let's exclude the New King James Version, how often was it updated and adapted and changed? And do we know how many times the text itself was actually adapted?
Yeah, man, that's a really good question. So the standard English catalog that's used today, or one of the standards, is the Herbert, Darlow, and Mould catalog. List out editions of the English Bible. If you sit down and count the editions that the King James went through just in the record that he records from 1611 to sometime in the 1800s, I think I counted one time over 800.
Oh my
So he's
goodness.
listing, yeah, some 800 different editions. Now we understand most of those are someone simply sitting down and trying to reprint the King James, but every
Okay.
time you set the text freshly, unless you leave the text standing with the printing press, every time you reset the text and reset the type, there's going to be minor textual changes. And you have an editor, a typesetter, who's making minor textual changes. Most of the changes that are made in a particular edition don't continue into other editions, right?
Okay.
Like most people are, that's not the genealogy that's being traced. But yeah, every one of those editions is going to have minor changes. There have been maybe 4 what we might call more major revisions of the text, where people intentionally who were in charge of printing the King James text at Oxford or Cambridge sat down and attempted to go over the whole text systematically, and revise it to make it more accurately. That's happened probably 4 times.
Okay.
And those, I would consider those revisions as opposed to a new edition of the King James. So the King James text has, in that sense, been revised 4 times, but also gone through 100 or so or hundreds of so minor additions.
Well, to respond to this myth, all we have to do is show one change in one word, and there's
That's right.
certainly more than that.
Yeah.
Myth number 4: the translators of the King James Bible spoke in unison.
Yeah. Again, I think a fairly common myth. Certainly, most people who've done deep study of the history of the King James can recognize that, or who know anything about translation today, can recognize that anytime you put together a couple of translators in a room, you're going to have differing opinions. But you'll hear very commonly, and I'll show where this myth comes up a lot in my experience. If someone sits down and says, I think the King James Bible is wrong in this text here, sometimes people will immediately retort, well, who are you to disagree with 50 some odd of the greatest translators that ever lived? Well, the moment they make that objection, they're seeing the text as the product of a group of translators working in unison. But that's just not
Gotcha.
necessarily what took place. The translators worked, the translation was produced in 3 broad stages. In the first stage, they divided, the revisers divided into 6 companies. So you've got 7 or 8 men in a room, not all of them together, but 7 or 8 men in a room working on the text. And then once they've each produced a revision of their portion, they sent it to stage 2, which was a meeting rather, that took place at Stationers' Company in London in 1610. It had just 12 men there. And what those 12 men essentially did was make veto decisions about what the earlier companies had decided. Earlier companies might have had 2 different readings that they proposed, and these 12 men made the final veto decision, sometimes disagreeing with what those earlier companies had done. And then you had a final group of editors, 2 or 3 men, that went over the whole text and may even have made some minor changes to the text at that point. So you really don't have like this mythical perfect agreement between all
Gotcha.
the translators. In fact, you never had all the translators sitting together in one room, like this image that some people have in their mind of 60 or some odd men gathered around a table, all discussing and agreeing. That just never happened. They were never all together. They certainly didn't always agree, and they sometimes had earlier decisions reversed by later, smaller
Oh.
committees.
Now, as I've looked into the New World Translation of Jehovah's Witnesses, the knowledge of Greek in the languages is just unbelievably minimal. By
Mm,
no standard that I've seen could you remotely call these translators experts.
right.
On the King James Bible, even though they didn't speak in unison, were these bona fide scholars and experts who translated it?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually think that for the most part, there's a few exceptions, but for the most part, the men who worked on the King James Bible probably knew Greek and Hebrew better than almost any scholar today. We tend to learn
Wow.
the languages, like myself, in a seminary setting, where we're primarily aimed at reading a biblical text, whereas many of them started at a very young age speaking the languages,
Mm,
speaking them to one another. That's just a different level of fluency that most biblical scholars, certainly not all, but most biblical scholars today don't quite reach that level. Obviously, our understanding of the language has changed and grown, and we've learned a lot more about syntax. We've learned a lot more from early papyri about vocabulary, what particular words mean. But as far as individual scholars learning the languages, they were absolutely scholars, unrivaled in their day, again, with maybe a few exceptions.
hmm.
And yeah, they were very, very competent to handle the original languages.
That's awesome. And that's another testament why it's been so powerfully used
Mm,
over the years and
that's right.
remains to this day. Myth number 5: little is known about the King James Bible formation.
Yeah. Again, not quite as common a myth, but I pretty regularly run into people who I'll say something again about, well, this King James translator, I think, made an error here. And the response will be, well, we have no idea what they did. And then they'll always make this point. the records about the King James Bible were destroyed in the Great Fire of London in 1666, so we have no idea how it was produced. Okay, well, I'll grant you some records have been lost. We don't
Okay.
know as much about the King James Bible as I wish we knew, but we know more about the formation of the King James Bible than any comparable early modern English translation. Vastly
Hmm.
more. I mentioned earlier that there were 6 companies that worked on the text. It would be amazing to have draft work from one of those companies, right? Like a Shakespeare scholar would be just amazed to have original draft work from one of Shakespeare's plays. But with the discoveries that have been made in the last few years, we now have draft work from text that was assigned to all 6 of those companies. Like the
Wow.
amount of materials that have been discovered are just unparalleled in regards to any other early modern English Bible. We do still have questions. There's a lot that I don't know that I wish we could know, but we know way more about how the King James Bible was produced than any comparable early modern English translation.
So it sounds like, if I heard you correctly, that if we take the King James Bible and its formation, it far surpasses any other translations
Hmm.
in terms of what we know, but also in comparison with other non biblical texts like Shakespeare. Does the Bible still stand in its category of its own, the King James Bible, in terms of what we know about it? Is that fair?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, absolutely. I don't think there's a single Shakespeare scholar who would disagree with this, that we know more
Hmm.
about the formation of the King James than we do about the formation of any of Shakespeare's plays. It was such a
Wow.
monument in
Hmm.
Britain at the time of the obviously of the English Bible translation and what came to be standard and of the work that was done on it. So people kept records. People recorded copies of the translators working, copies of their notes, copies of the rules, copies of the king's correspondence about it. So all that was just kept. And so there's been a great deal of material preserved for us. Again, not as much as we wish. Certainly, we've lost some things, but there's a great deal of it that's been preserved just
Hmm.
because it became the monument to the English language that it is.
So, in sum, when we compare the formation of the King James Bible with other older Bible translations, non Christian works like Shakespeare, it stands in a category of its own. So, even though we wish we knew more and always do, this idea that it's a conspiracy and we don't know much about it is just false.
Yeah, that's right.
Myth number 6: the King James Bible is a perfectly literal translation.
Hmm. Yeah, again, a common myth where people, typically who are those in that defending category, defending the King James Bible, will sometimes assume and claim that the King James Bible is the most literal translation out there. That's just not true. And then sometimes they'll also assume that it's literal in every place. Now, the reality is that we could kind of draw out a spectrum of how translations work between more literal and less literal. And over on the more literal strand, if you went far enough, you'd have something like an interlinear or even like a Young's literal translation. And on that less literal span today, you might have a paraphrase like the Message or the Living Bible.
Sure.
A translation tends to pick a point on that continuum that they aim for most of the time. But in any particular text, they'll sometimes move in passages to passages along that spectrum. So in one passage, they'll be more literal. In another passage, they'll be less literal. Every translation does that, including the King James Bible. One clear example that I like to point out is what translators sometimes call concordance. This is not all that's related to quote unquote literalness, and literal itself is kind of a confusing term that can be misused. But one element of quote unquote literal translation is concordance, the idea that you're going to translate into the target language and use as much as possible the same language, the same word in English every time a particular Hebrew or Greek word shows up. So if that word shows up 10 times, you translate it 10 times as much as possible with the exact same English word. Part of the fad linguistically of the day when the KJV was produced was to resist that trend. And
Hmm.
Miles Smith explains in the preface to the King James Bible in one of the last 2 sections that instead they felt the liberty to use synonyms as widely as possible, even when there was no need to. So in any one particular
Huh.
text, you can sometimes find, I listed a couple of examples in the article, like Romans 5, you can find the same Greek word 3 times where Paul means the same thing and is repeating himself for emphasis. But the KJV translators, just for the sake of variety, have translated it with 3 different words in English.
Interesting.
It was kind of a linguistic fad of their day.
Yeah.
It didn't last long, but it's a clear example of the King James Bible not being quote unquote perfectly literal and doing so intentionally. They were very upfront. Smith was very upfront
Mm.
about that being an intention that they had.
That's such an interesting fact. I was not aware of that. I've been reading Galatians with a group of high school students, and Paul is
Mm,
like, it's a false gospel in 1:8. Let me say it again. Like, he repeats stuff for
right.
emphasis. And if you
That's right.
change the word, even with a synonym, I think it's easy to get lost the emphasis of what Paul is doing. So, good intention,
Yeah.
but might not be the best translation. I'm glad they corrected it.
Yeah.
Myth number 7, the King James Bible is written in Old English.
Hmm. Yeah. Again, a really common opinion held by people who don't know a lot about the history of languages. And the same thing happens with Shakespeare. I meet people regularly who will say, "Oh, well, Shakespeare's written in Old English," but they just don't know the history of the language well enough to know that the way the English historians or historians of English break down the categories, they wouldn't be able to pick up and read an Old English text. Like if you were to pick up Beowulf, not in translation, but
Right.
just in its original and try to read it, that's a good example of Old English. And you
Okay.
won't be able to understand unless you're used to reading an Old English text. You won't be able to understand almost any of it. Well, the King
Hmm.
James Bible is not incomprehensible like that. And sometimes when people assume that, they'll say, "Oh, well, it's Old English. I can't read it. I can't understand it." Technically, the designation that's used by the Oxford English Dictionary, as it charts out the history of the English language, is the King James Bible lands in what's called early modern English. Um, so it's not necessarily the English exactly like we speak today. It's from that early modern period, but it does not fall into the Old English period or even
Okay.
into the Middle English period, the
Hmm.
next category. It falls into the early modern English category, just like Shakespeare, Donne, some of the other stuff that was produced in that time. That means it's hard to read. Certainly, it's going to take some work, especially like you mentioned, working with high schoolers. I've worked with high schoolers for years. I think most high schoolers are not going to be able to pick up the King James Bible and
Yeah.
understand all of it without some work. Um, but for someone that's got maybe like a college level education and is used to reading an older text, certainly if they can pick up Shakespeare and read it, they
Yeah.
would be able to pick up a King James Bible and understand it. They are going to have to work hard. There's some funny word endings, the EST and ETH word endings that they're going to have to get used to. Thou dost, he doth, cometh, goeth, etc. And these and thous that we're not used to today as second person singular and plural pronouns. But with a little work, it can be understood, and it is definitely not Old English. It is early modern English, not the same as what we speak today exactly, but understandable if you do a little work.
The article that we got these 7 myths from come below, and people, I invite them to go look at it and read it. You go into a little bit more depth and give some examples for each one of these.
Mm-hmm.
But when I've often written an article, 7 this, 5 this, 10 this, when I'm done, I think, oh, I could have added this one.
Oh,
Have you looked back at this article and thought, you know what, these are the 7 big ones? Or are there any other myths, if you did an update about the King James Bible, that you might include, or you just didn't include for some reason in the first place?
yeah. So sure. Actually, when I sit down to write the article, I wrote out. I bet I wrote several dozen possible
Oh,
myths,
wow.
and then tried to
Wow.
wheedle down the
Wow.
ones that would be. I didn't use one category to choose, but I wanted to pick some that were common, some
Sure.
that weren't already treated in other places, and some that wouldn't be deeply polemic. Like there's some other myths that I could have listed that would just immediately have started a fight with certain people. So I whittled it down to pick those 7. But yeah, I can
Okay.
come up with a much longer list for sure.
Gotcha. Are there any in particular, and you don't have to go there if you don't want to? I'm not looking to pick a fight. Are there any others that pop to mind you want to include, or just
Uh,
keep
sure, I
going?
could mention one that I almost wrote on. And the reason I didn't is because it's less common today. I
Okay.
almost wrote to explain that the King James Bible was not translated by James himself. I think that used to be a really
Oh,
common idea at the popular level. People would hear, "Oh, King James Bible, that means the Bible that King James translated." But in my experience, there was kind of an explosion of scholarship on the King James around its 400-year anniversary, like 2011 ish. And since that time, I just don't really see anybody repeating that myth.
okay.
So it used to be really common, and it's just less common today. So I thought, you know what? There's not even any point in dealing with that in an article. I do still meet people that think that, but it's very, very rare.
I'm guessing there's an obvious answer to this, but why did they specifically name it the King James Bible?
Oh, that's a great question. The official title that's listed on the title page, and I've got a link to it there in the article. It's much longer. It's I can't even think to say it all off the top of my head. It's like
That's
a
fine.
paragraph long title. But what we do with all of the early modern English Bibles is we give them little short titles, like we call Tyndale's Bible, the Geneva Bible, the
Mm,
Bishop's Bible. None of those are the official titles of that particular text. It's just a short form way of talking about it. And I will say a word quickly about using that title. There has been debate about what the best short form is. Should we call it the King James Version? Should we call it the Authorized Version?
Mm.
Should we call it the King James Bible? I think David Norton, a scholar who published with Cambridge, is exactly right that King James Version and King James, or rather, Authorized Version and King James Bible accidentally got conflated. So when we talk about the King James Version, it's an accidental misconflation, an accidental conflation and confusion of those two terms, and it's really not the best title for it. So King James Bible is the short form title that almost all scholars writing in the field today use when they
Mm.
describe it.
I'm curious what you think the proper role might be for the King James Bible today. And here's how I think about it. And feel free to be like, McDowell, you are totally missing it. But I think about this almost like hymns. Like there's certain older,
Mm.
beautiful hymns that I don't want to lose because
Oh,
they're
that's good.
theocentric. They give us a tie to our history. They still minister to older generations. And when we sing them, younger generations realize it's not just about them. So I want it to be a part of what we do, but I don't want to overdo it and I
Mm.
don't want to lose it. Is that a
Mm.
fair way in your mind of thinking about this?
Yeah, no, I think that's a perfect analogy. On
Mm.
the one hand, I think every English speaking Christian would be enriched by reading the King James Bible. Like, if you're able to get one and you speak English, I'd encourage you to read it. It's a monument of our English language, just like reading Shakespeare. And I think it deserves to have a continued place on our shelves and in our studies for the rest of our time as an English speaking language. But on
Mm.
the other hand, yeah, I would caution us. I don't think, to put it another way, I think every Christian should read the King James Bible. I don't think any Christian should only read the King James Bible. It's not necessarily reflective of the most modern advances in exegesis, commentary work, lexical work, um, translation work. Highly recommend a more modern English translation also to be used in your study. So use it for sure, but I don't think it's wise to only use the King James Bible, either in your own personal study or in a ministerial context. But I like your analogy. That's good. Keep it around. It does have
Okay.
a beautiful tradition and heritage. We want the beauty of that majestic language to speak into us, but we don't necessarily want it to be the only thing we sing.
Now, Tim, you didn't use this word, but so I'm going to put it in your mouth that you would describe the people who originally translated the King James Bible as just like wizards in Greek. They were masters.
Sure.
And yet, hundreds of years has passed. What do we know now, and what tools do we maybe have that could
Mm,
help us better translate, come up with maybe better translations? And I realize even using the term better is somewhat subjective, but
sure.
what
Sure.
tools and knowledge and insights do we have now that they didn't have?
Man, that's a really good question. A couple things. On the one hand, we know a great deal about what tools they had. We have records of library slips of them checking out particular grammars from the library as they do
Wow.
their work. So we can look back and say, here's the grammar that they were working from. Well, there's been a lot of advances in the field specifically of lexical studies. It used to be really common in their day to talk about what some have called Holy Ghost Greek. So you'd come along to words in the New Testament that are only used once, or constructions that only appear once or twice, and they would just assume that this was sort of an innovation that the Holy Spirit had made in the text of the New Testament. Well, after the 1900s, when Adolf Diesmann discovered a massive cache of millions of papyri, like old from the era of the New Testament, grocery list, shopping list,
Hmm.
personal letters, we've now been able to sit down and realize all the words in the New Testament were extremely common in the era of the New Testament. This isn't special Holy Ghost Greek. This is the common Koine language of everyday people that they spoke on the street. So we're in a much better position to
Makes sense.
understand the meaning of words in both Greek and Hebrew. And the translators admitted that. Smith admits in his preface, there's lots of words that are used only once that, as he puts it, have no cousin. And he goes, well,
Hmm.
we don't know what those mean. Well, we're in a much better position to examine what those words mean today. So there's been some advancements specifically in lexical work. There have also been massive advancements in the way that we translate
Okay.
after Eugene Nida and the translation principles that he introduced, and just the recognition that we can more profitably shoot to speak to people in their common vernacular language, the language of the man on the street, so to speak. And he started doing that primarily on the mission field as they were producing translations there, and then filtered into the way we produce English translations. And today, most translators recognize that we should shoot to be as literal as possible, yes, in one sense, and as accurate, and perhaps as majestic as we can be, but also we need to make readability an important emphasis in the way that we translate. And I think that's been a development that maybe wouldn't have existed as much in their time.
What about manuscripts? Have we discovered more manuscripts in the past few, really, centuries that give us
Yes.
greater insight into what the original would have said than the manuscripts that this committee was working with?
See, now you're going to get me in trouble with some of my
Oh,
friends. But yes, no, I would definitely agree. Sometimes people will misspeak about how many manuscripts the King James translators would have had access to. You can go YouTube and Google, and you can find people claiming that they gathered together thousands of Greek New Testament manuscripts in
okay.
their day, and that's just not true. On the other hand, you'll occasionally hear people say that their text was based on only 4 or 5 Greek New Testament manuscripts. That's not true either. The King James translators didn't use manuscripts; they used the printed Greek text of their day.
Mm,
Those texts were primarily the text of Erasmus, Stephanus, and Beza, and those men did their best with what they had. Erasmus
mm,
used maybe a dozen manuscripts for his first edition in 1516, discovered a few more along the way. Stephanus lists 16 in his apparatus, so we know exactly how many he's making use of. We have them listed there in the apparatus. Beza adds a few more, so maybe grand total will approximate the Greek text that they were working from had been based on maybe a few dozen Greek New Testament manuscripts. Today, we have somewhere around 5,000 plus, and it's hard to get an exact number. Textual critics will
sure.
tell you anytime you get an exact number, you're most likely going to be wrong. But just roundly speaking, well over 5,000 manuscripts of the Greek New Testament. And we have a number of manuscripts much older than any of the manuscripts the work that they were using had been based on. So we've got
Mm,
many, many more manuscripts and much older manuscripts
mm.
than had informed their work. So yes, there's definitely been some developments in the broad field of New Testament textual criticism as well.
I've got some more broad questions for you, but one that's a little bit more particular, I imagine you've heard or been challenged with, is just that people will say it doesn't matter that the King James Version is not readable
Mm,
because we are supposed to, and this is actually a quote from 2 Timothy 2:15. I'm sure you've heard this argument where in the King James, and I'm probably going to mispronounce it, apology to those, study to shew thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. This has been used, as far as I understand, to say, hey, even if this isn't super readable, we're supposed to study the text and it
mm,
shouldn't be easy for us. And yet, I believe you've pushed back at this some points and say that's actually misunderstanding of the text. Is
that's
that
right.
right?
Yeah. Well, let me
Okay.
say two things there. First, on the one hand, this idea that the language of the Bible should be in this exalted, majestic prose, even if we don't understand it, is something that the King James translators and the men that produced their text, like Erasmus, were themselves pushing back on. Like it was a common view in that time that Latin was the ecclesiastical language, like the
Okay.
rich language of the church, and the text existed in Latin. And there were people who didn't want the text to be translated into English because they made that same argument. It doesn't matter if you understand it, it doesn't matter if it makes sense to you, it's the Bible. And the Bible should be in this exalted, elevated prose, which in their time meant being in Latin and not in English. Well, Miles Smith, in the preface to the King James, just pushes back against that really hard. That assertion was made by Gregory Martin in the preface to the Rhymes New Testament, the Catholic translation of 1582. And he just says no. Even though translation is going to
Hmm.
bring the text down and be imperfect, we should work to put the Bible into English and language that people can understand. And he builds this beautiful analogy to the original text and the modern day translations of it. He says, just like the first temple under Solomon was beautiful and glorious and massive, and when
Yeah.
the second temple was built under Zerubbabel, it was such a disappointment that people wept.
Hmm.
But God was in both places. And he says the same thing is true of translation. Yes, the
Hmm.
original languages give the Bible in a more exalted, accurate, perfect understanding. And when we translate it, something's always lost in translation, but God is still in both.
Hmm.
So he was convinced that we could and should put the text into understandable English. And then second, just about that text in 2 Timothy 2:15, when people quote the text that way, they are frankly acknowledging, and you'll see people do this, Sam Gipp, William Grady, others, and they'll in fact put that text alongside a modern translation where it doesn't say study to show thyself approved. And they'll say, look, they've taken out the command to study the Bible. Your new modern Bible has removed the command to study the Bible. they are just misunderstanding not only the Greek text behind the English, they're misunderstanding the English language itself that's printed in the King James Bible. That word study at that time in English really didn't mean open a group of books and study
Interesting.
like we would think of the term study today. It
Interesting.
just meant to be diligent, which is how it's usually
Mm,
translated in a modern version. Be diligent, be in
mm.
earnest. So when they read that as a command to have to work hard to understand the Bible and study it, they're really revealing that they have misread the English of the King James Bible, which is unfortunate. And it is one of the reasons, situations like that are one of the reasons why I would say every Christian can benefit from reading a King James Bible, but no one should read only a King James Bible, or they're likely
Mm.
to end up with a mistaken interpretation like that.
That's a very ironic point to point out to those who just believe we should only use this translation of the text. Now, you mentioned the translators originally were creating a translation that was in the modern vernacular and understood by people. Now, if that was their desire, then how would they view using the King James Version today, given that the vernacular has changed so much?
Man, that's a good question, and it's a more complex question in some ways than I can answer
Okay.
directly, because there is debate among scholars about precisely why the King James Bible has the register of English that it does. My personal recommendation is that anybody interested in the subject get a hold of the essay by Robin Griffith Jones in this
Wow.
collection of works published at SBL. He makes the case that the particular register of English found in the King James Bible, whether they intended it to be or not, it landed at the place that it did because that was the language of the liturgy of the Anglican Church in the Book of Common Prayer that all of them had been raised on, the homilies that they had heard preached every single year. So that may not have been the these and thous, so to speak, may not have been the language of the man on the street of their day. So they,
Okay.
in translating the text that way, weren't maybe necessarily saying this is the language of the man on the street, but it was the language of their liturgy. I think he's probably right. Some disagree. Some do think that they were aiming at the language of the man on the street. But I do think Richard Burridge is right when he says in that same book that nothing would argue more. I'm paraphrasing him. He said nothing would argue more strongly against the use of the King James Bible today as the sole ministerial translation, like the
Right.
church saying this is all we're going to preach from, all we're going to read from, all our people are going to study from. Nothing speaks more clearly against that than the principles that Miles Smith laid down in the preface to the King James Bible itself, where he said the Bible should be understood even of the very vulgar. They did want people to be, even if they were aiming at a liturgical language, they did want people to be able to pick up the Bible, read it, and understand it. And that's not necessarily going to be the case today for someone picking up a King James without some extra work. And I think they would be, we can't say for sure. I think, though, that they would probably be very much in favor of the trend towards more modern English translation today that speaks in a more modern form of the language. Sean, forgive me, I've lost you there. I can't hear you.
You know what? That was me. I paused
Oh,
it. I hit mute by accident. So you're saying that they would use the ESV? No, I'm kidding. That was my joke. You don't have to say what translation you think is closest. That's a whole separate conversation. But it is interesting that their goal, 400 years ago plus, was accomplished arguably at its time. But if they had the
right.
same goal today, it would look very different, and hence they would
That's right.
assess the use of the King James Bible very differently.
That's right.
Um, are debates over the King James Version and kind of the way we're having them, is this a uniquely American phenomena? Is this a global phenomena? Do you see it in
Hmm.
Europe as well? Because there's a certain kind of fundamentalism with this that we do see a lot in America on a range of issues. How widespread is this debate?
That's a good question. I think in the 1930s, debate about the King James took a kind of different turn that we might call King James onlyist, so to speak. I mean, the King James had been used again for several hundred years at that point, but things took a little bit of a turn. And then in the 50s and 60s, as fundamentalism was wrestling, North American fundamentalism was
Yeah.
wrestling with its identity and trying to feel that they were still fighting the battle against liberals, some wings of fundamentalism then adopted defense of the King James because they could feel like they were still arguing that same battle that Machen had fought. Oh, the liberals are denying the Bible and we're holding to it. So it did have a very large expression in North America, particularly in
Mm,
certain fundamentalist groups, what I would call modern day fundamentalist groups. It does extend globally too, though. There's a really similar trend that took place in Australia, for example.
huh.
There is some expression of it in Europe. It's much smaller, but there's an expression of it in Britain as well. I would say the predominant expression of that kind of adherence to the King James is North American, but yeah, there's a global element
Okay.
to it as well.
How widespread is the scholarship on this? You grabbed a book from the SBL,
Mm.
Society of Biblical Literature, which is not a conservative evangelical organization
Oh,
like
right.
the Evangelical Theological Society. Is this ongoing? Are there books coming out regularly? Is it fading to the background? What's the scope of scholarship on this question?
That's a really good question. So, beginning at about 2011, the 400-year anniversary of the King James, there was a lot more scholars that turned their attention to the text. And there were also, just in the last few decades, been a number of discoveries of documents from the King James translators themselves that are currently being studied. So there's scholarship being produced right now. Jeffrey Miller, I think, has a grant right now to study
Hmm.
Samuel Ward's notes, the very first draft of the King James Apocrypha that he's working on. Nick Hardy is producing right now a volume with Yale University Press, which will be a big, massive investigation of the history of the creation of the King James. So there's a number of scholars that weren't focused on the King James Bible that have sort of turned their attention to the King James Bible in the last few decades. Several major publications through Cambridge and Oxford. And there is, yes, ongoing work about it. And I look forward to that work being done and love would someday in some small way to contribute to it.
Okay, so I wasn't aware of this. This shows some naivete, but it wasn't only just the 66 books of the Old Testament and New Testament that are translated, but the
Mm,
Apocrypha was translated. So
that's right.
do King James Version only accept the King James Version of the Apocrypha, or do they
Uh,
reject it? And if so, why?
Good question. To my knowledge, no one who would label themselves as King James only does accept the Apocrypha. But the Apocrypha was printed in the original 1611 King James Bible. It was translated. There was a separate committee that worked on the translation of it. And looking back, I think people can very easily make two different errors when they see that. On the one hand, you'll get people that will claim, oh, well, the King James Bible had the Apocrypha, so they all held a Roman Catholic view of the Apocrypha. And then on
Mm,
the other hand, you'll get people that'll look back and kind of reinterpret that moment through the Westminster Assembly in 1645. And they say, no, 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 they completely rejected the Apocrypha. Neither one of those things is true. It was, I mean, if you're aware of the Anglican Church today and the way it kind of seeks to frame itself as a via media, the
yeah.
status of the Apocrypha in 1611 was debated. And there were some people who didn't want it in their Bibles, some people who did want it in the Bible. Most of them held Jerome's view that it was sort of, if canon at all, it was a secondary canon. Um, so it ended up in the King James Bible, although that certainly made some people like John Reynolds, one of the translators, very upset. But yeah, it was there. I don't know any King James onlyists today who would accept it on that basis, but it was a part of the original translation.
That is super interesting. I was not aware of that. Now, just a couple more questions for you, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
I
Sure.
realize this is somewhat of a loaded question, but what do you consider the best translation, or what are just some wise ways, maybe a few translations that you think are helpful for Christians or non Christians to read the Bible today, and why?
Yeah. So I don't love the question, what is the best translation? I realize you're asking it carefully because of that.
Yeah.
Because I think we can slip into the mode of picking one particular translation and zoning in on that as the best and then not benefiting from others.
Hmm.
Translators, and this is an original of me, I can't remember where I first heard it. I think maybe Dan Wallace. But translators have to work to produce something and they have competing goals that pull them in different directions. On the one hand, they want to be as accurate and as literal to the text as possible. So that pulls them over in one direction. But they want to produce a text that's readable and understandable and be as understandable as possible. And that pulls them in an opposite direction. But then on the other hand, if you follow the advice of Leland Ryken and the guys that worked on the ESV and some others that have written, because it's God's word, we want it to be elegant. So we're
Mm,
pushing for elegance, and that kind of pulls against readability and
wow.
sometimes pulls against accuracy. So no translation, if we do a triangle, no translation can do all three of those things perfectly. Every translation is going to lean one way or another and do one of those things probably better than the others. Some do aim to be like a middle point. The CSB aims at what they call optimal equivalence,
Yep.
trying to kind of land in the middle. And I think they do a generally speaking good job. The King James Version obviously lands very heavily on that elegant elegant, majestic English side.
Mm-hmm.
I think it does that better than any English translation, but it's definitely not the most readable translation. There are people who claim that, but they just either are ignorant or aren't being honest with the data. So I think people should read broadly from translations that do each of those things well. So I pick up regularly an NIV because I want, or an NLT, a New Living Translation, because I
Mm-hmm.
want a very readable text, even if it's a little bit paraphrastic. Sometimes I want to be able to just soak in the biblical text in a language that's exactly what I would speak to a friend at work, and it's super readable. But sometimes I want a more literal translation, and I'll pick up an ESV, and I love the ESV. I preach from the ESV a lot. Our church uses the ESV as kind of a standard ministerial text. But sometimes I want the beautiful, majestic language that's been around for 400 years, and so I still regularly, every single week, I read in my King James Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And I would encourage people not to have just one translation that they read. To really do all three of those things well, your best bet is to read from several different good translations.
Do you ever read the Message or the Passion translation?
I don't recommend the Passion Translation at all. I think Mike Winger has done a really good job interviewing some scholars and pointing out some serious problems in that work. I do read the Message. I'm perfectly fine with paraphrase.
Hmm.
It has its place in the church. A lot of people don't realize this. Erasmus of Rotterdam in the 1500s, he produced a paraphrase of the Bible. It was translated into English, and it was required by royal injunction to be in every single parish church. Like, it was a huge part of the English Reformation. And his translation is much more free than the Message Bible. So there's a long history in the church of paraphrase. I think it's beautiful. It has its place. I don't think anyone should take a paraphrase as their primary study or preaching Bible. Like, I would never preach out of the Message. I would
Sure.
never make it my primary study Bible, but I use it sometimes in my devotions, and I think we can profitably do so.
Tim, what would you say to yourself 7 or 8 years ago before you
Oh,
kind of went on this journey to change what we've been talking about here, how you understand the King James translation? If you were going to speak
yeah,
back, and part of you might wonder if you would have listened to yourself anyways. I think
sure.
of issues that I've changed my life on, how much I would have listened. So, that aside, what would you say to your earlier self that embraced that, for lack of a better term, King James only perspective?
Mm. I would say, in fact, I wouldn't talk about Bible translations at all, but I would
Hmm.
set that young version of Tim aside and say, Tim, your faith is unhealthy because Jesus is not at its center. You may be a believer, you're a preacher, you're a
Wow.
Bible college graduate, but Jesus Christ, the risen person of Jesus, is not the person that you're in love with, and he needs to be. Fall in love with Jesus, fall in love with the gospel, and let every other thing in your life be secondary. And as Jesus becomes more important and the gospel becomes more important in your life, without even trying to, all of the other things will become secondary by comparison.
That was beautiful. I feel like I should drop the mic and end this thing, but I know some people want to know as a final question how they can follow you, maybe your work with the Text and Canon Institute, our friend Peter Gurry. He's
Mm-hmm.
come on here before, and Anthony Ferguson, and just had
Oh
phenomenal
yeah.
interviews on my channel. Thoroughly enjoyed having both of them. But maybe just tell us how we can follow you and what you're aiming to study into the future.
Yeah, so you can find my article at TCI. You can also go to kjbhistory.com, where I very slowly have been producing blogs. I'll eventually blog my way through the entire creation of the King James Bible and
Wow.
then its reception history. I'm doing that very slowly because I'm trying to work with the primary source documents and do some good work. And I do it and eventually intend to complete a PhD in New Testament textual criticism that specifically studies the Greek text that is the basis of the King James Bible. So all of that'll come through on the blog eventually. If you follow me there, that's the place where it will all go.
Keep me posted as you do that research. If you think kind of a more popular audience, especially interested in apologetics, would be
Mm,
interested in that research,
sure.
we'd love to have you back. Super, super good job. Really clear. Appreciate your voice. This is a lot of fun.
Yeah. Likewise. Thanks for having me on.